Hello, 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 hello. All right. Good evening, everyone. Such as we are, we got a few away thanks to hockey. I think that got stuck in my throat. That and other pursuits. That welcome to our introduction to the book of Colossians. So, as we begin, tell me, what do you know about the book of Colossians? I hear voices. Hey, oh, there they are. We will pause and reboot. Get it? You had a boot, and yeah. Well, yeah, yeah. There is cake and coffee for those of you who are physically present. If you're online and watching, I'm afraid you're on your own for snacks. We cannot mail it or digitally give you cake. But we'll try and give you the bread of the word, but we can't give you cake. All right, back to the question at hand. What do you know about Colossians? There's some good. Any verses in particular you can think of, Joyce? Oh, good. Good. We'll be revisiting that tonight. So,
Chapter 3 was the passage they preached on at our wedding.
oh, husbands, love your wives. Yes, that one, right? Good, good. Yes, exactly. Anything else? Going once? Going twice? Very good. Excellent. It's written to the people at Colossae. If you look on that little map in front of you there, you will see, and I will help you see. Here, there's a map. I don't know if that's focused or not, but there's a map. All right. There on the southern edge of what is today Turkey, you see Rome and Italy, and then you'll see the Mediterranean Sea and Egypt, Alexandria and Jerusalem, so on. And then that little box goes, whoop, it zooms into that little section right on the coast. And you'll see, starting in the top left-hand corner, you see Ephesus, to which the book of Ephesians written. And then south you get Prine or Prine, whatever however it's pronounced. And then Miletus, not the coffee maker. And then you see the meandering river, and then you see Laodicea. What is Laodicea famous for? Yeah, exactly. Church of the Book of Revelation. And then Colossae, which is on the Lycus River right there. So it's deep there within. It's one of the cities in Turkey. So that's where the early church started, of course. This letter was written by Paul while he was in prison, part of called the prison epistles or the prison letters. And unlike the other letters, Paul didn't plant this church. He didn't know these people. He only knew of them through a friend of his, Epaphras. So this is kind of a unique setting. Through Epaphras, he hears about what's happening in Colossae, and then he writes them a letter. So Epaphras had been in Colossae. He goes over and visits Paul in prison, and he's updating them on the churches in Turkey. This is how it's going. This is how it's going. And he brings up the story of what's happening in Colossae. Now, Paul may well have written letters to many of the churches or that aren't in Scripture, but this was by the inspiration of the Spirit, has been preserved for us. And you'll see as we go, I hope very clearly why this letter in particular was preserved, because it has such a strong opening. And so Epaphras mentions to Paul some of the issues the church in Colossae is facing, and Paul writes as a response to that. The letter has three purposes. First off, it is to glorify Christ. The second is to address the issues that Epaphras brings forward, and then to challenge them to live the Christian life. And it's called the habitus, the way of life. And so this letter, it flows really nicely as far as letters go. It's a smooth, well-written letter. There's an opening movement focusing on Jesus. They call it the cosmic Christ, which we'll look at the week after next, the exalted Jesus. And then he describes his own suffering, and he, as a response to the exalted Christ, has given his life, and as a consequence is suffering. We saw in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians this Sunday in church about, as Ethan read for us, all the sufferings of Paul. And then he talks about the pressures and the false gospel, and then he introduces them or reintroduces them or reaffirms to them this new way of life. So if you look, what Colossians is about is see Jesus, fight heresy, write a new story. If you can remember that way, see Jesus, fight heresy, write a new story. That is the heart of the book of Colossians. In coming out of the book of Hebrews and Romans and Corinthians, this is a nice, easy letter to study. Uh, it is see Jesus, that this is not probably, this is outside of Revelation with its incredibly high view of the glorified Christ, glowing in gold in the sash, that this is the second highest. This is Christ glorified. And what we see in the first two chapters is actually a song or a poem, most likely a song, that was sung. So we get a hymn or a poem, and Paul inserts that in here. And this becomes the foundation of the new life. And then he fights against our old friend, the Judaizers, which we will be familiar with, but a new enemy that you may not be familiar with called the Gnostics. Not like gnocchi, that food that we eat at supper sometime, but Gnosticism, and then the general Roman religion. But it really focuses on the Judaizers, and all this is just prequel. We'll get into it as time goes. The whole issue of Gnosticism, which just means knowledge. And then he talks about how to write a new story. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. This contrasting set of stories between how the Romans lived their life and how Paul calls them to live the new life. All right. Any thoughts just on that little blurb? Everybody's kind of see where we're going. So what are the three main foci or focus of Colossians? See Jesus? See Jesus, fight heresy, write a new story. If you can grind that into your brain, you will have said, I understand Colossians at a cursory glance. All right. The city itself is critical. It's the background of why things were happening. Colossae is a large commercial center, not as large as it used to be. It's a city in decline. The valley, as you saw on that little map, in which Colossae is located, is part of the ancient Mediterraneans, was one of the world's leading producers of wool, especially black wool. So that valley would be agriculturally rich in raising sheep, and then dyed wool as well because they have access to all the stuff that comes from the river, purple and scarlet, all these things of value. So, and there was a volcano in the area, which becomes a critical part of the story at a certain point, produced excellent pasture land and chalky water added to the dyeing process. So we've got a city of some wealth and means producing a rather unique item, black wool, or purple wool and purple or scarlet wool. In 60 AD, there was a volcanic eruption which damaged the city, and in 64, 4 years later, there was another one. So the city was destroyed several times, and the emperor kept rebuilding. The emperor, this is the story of so much. The empire had built a major east-west highway which bypassed Colossae. So originally it was on the river valley, then they built a highway above it, and then of course trade just petered away. So it was, if you ever watched the movie Cars, when the old Route 66 and gets bypassed, that's Colossae. Colossae is Radiator Springs, if that helps. The city was mostly Gentiles, a group called the Phrygians and Greek settlers, but there were also numerous Jews. In about 223, a couple hundred years before this happened, 2,000 Jews had been transported from Babylon, so there was a substantial Jewish community. We know that within good old Roman records, by AD 76, 11,000 Jewish men lived in the city. So that would be a significant portion of the population. So we get this hybrid of Roman culture and Jewish culture all rolling into one. All right. Rather than me prattle on, we are going to watch two videos that give us the outline. The one Joyce watched and a new one. that will give us a survey. So grab your cake, grab your coffee. This sheet with this is from the Bible Project, and he is going to outline that in the first video.
You want the light set?
Sure, Donna.
So,
Now, I'm streaming content made by Bible Project. I'm not sure if YouTube will kick us off or not. We'll see. So if it does, I'll just reboot it.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work.
We got to turn that volume up. Oops. It's a good time to check your cake. Well, let's try that and see if that helps. Well, that's Ruth. That's not going to help us. Sounds like it clicked in.
Paul's letter to the Colossians. It was written during one of Paul the Apostle's many imprisonments for announcing Jesus as the risen Lord. And the letter's addressed to a group of people that Paul had never met, who made up a church community that he didn't start. This church in Colossae was started by a co-worker of Paul's named Epaphras, who was actually from that city. And Epaphras had recently visited Paul in prison, and he updated him on how well the Colossians were doing overall, but he also mentioned some of the cultural pressures tempting them to turn away from Jesus. And so Paul wrote this letter to encourage the Colossians to address the issues that Epaphras had raised and then to challenge them to a greater devotion to Jesus. The letter's design and flow of thought are pretty easy to follow. The opening movement focuses on Jesus as the exalted Messiah. Paul then goes on to show how his suffering in prison is for the exalted Jesus. And then he addresses the pressures tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. After this, he explores the new way of life that Jesus' resurrection opened up for them. So the letter opens with two prayers. Paul first thanks God that he learned from Epaphras that the Colossians have been totally faithful to Jesus, showing love for God and their neighbors, all because of the hope they have in the new creation that Jesus has in store. And so he moves on to pray that they would grow in their wisdom and understanding about Jesus. And then Paul has placed a poem here to help the Colossians and us do exactly that. It's the centerpiece of chapter 1, a poem all about the crucified and exalted Messiah. It has two parallel stanzas, and it's crammed with language and imagery from the books of Genesis and Exodus, from the Psalms and the Proverbs. The first stanza explores how Jesus is the true image of God. In him, the full character and purpose of God is embodied in a human. He's the firstborn, an Old Testament phrase about Jesus' royal status over all creation. He shares in the very identity of the one true Creator God. And by him, all reality, all powers and authorities, spiritual and human, have been created. It's in Jesus the Messiah that we discover the very author and king of creation. And so in the second stanza, we discover he's also the one bringing about a new creation. He's the head of a new body, which refers to Jesus' people, who are the new humanity, of which his own resurrection existence is a prototype. In him, God's glorious temple presence dwells. And so it's through Jesus' death and resurrection that God has reconciled himself to humanity, to all spiritual powers, to all of creation. It's a remarkable poem, and Paul will keep referring back to it as he goes on in the letter. So he first shows how the truth of this poem transforms his own experience of suffering in prison. He's being punished for announcing to the Greek and the Roman world that Jesus is the resurrected Lord and King of all. And so his suffering, he thinks, is not a sign of defeat, defeat. It's actually his way of participating in Jesus' own suffering done as an act of love. And so his hardships are actually a cause for joy. He's in prison for the surprising news that Israel's resurrected Messiah is creating a new multi-ethnic family. And more, just as the divine glory dwelt in Jesus, so Jesus dwells in and among his international family. Or as Paul says, the Messiah is in you all, the hope of glory. Paul then addresses the cultural pressures that are tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. They were confronted by a combination of mystical polytheism along with a pressure to observe the laws of the Torah. So all these new Christians, they had grown up worshiping the various Greek and Roman gods who governed different arenas of human life. And many simply included Jesus as one more deity that they could worship. There was also great pressure from the Jewish Christian community for these non-Jews to complete their commitment to the Messiah by following all of the laws found in the Torah. Specifically, he mentions eating a kosher diet, observing sacred days, and circumcision. It's very similar to the problem he addressed in the letter to the Galatians. For Paul, to give in to either of these temptations is compromise. It's a failure to grasp who Jesus really is and what he did on their behalf. The Colossians used to live in fear of spiritual powers and elemental spirits, as Paul calls them. But Jesus triumphed over these through his death and resurrection. He freed the Colossians from any obligation to them. In the same way, Jesus fulfilled on our behalf all of the laws of the Torah, which never had the power to transform the selfish human heart anyway. And so what Jesus did in his life and death and resurrection, it lacks nothing. It doesn't need to be supplemented by following the laws. He is the reality to which all of the laws of the Torah were pointing anyway. Instead of the laws, followers of Jesus have the power of his resurrection to change them, which is what he goes on to explore. Following Jesus means joining his new humanity, because their lives have now been joined to the risen Jesus' life. And this is why Paul challenges the Colossians to set their minds on things above, where the Messiah is seated or rules at God's right hand. Now, Paul doesn't mean here, think about how you'll one day leave earth and go to heaven. Rather, the heavens are the transcendent place from which Jesus rules now over all of creation. And from there, he will one day return here to transform all things. Or, as Paul says, when the Messiah who is your life is revealed, you too will be revealed with him in glory. So Paul challenges them to live in the present as the kinds of new humans they will one day become. He uses the image of their old humanity, characterized by distorted sexuality and destructive speech. For Christians, that humanity died with Jesus and has been replaced by his own new humanity, which is characterized by mercy and generosity, by forgiveness and love. And this humanity, it transcends the ethnic and social boundary lines of our world to create, in Paul's words, a people where there is no one Greek or Jewish, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free, but the Messiah is all and is in all people. Paul then gets really practical, and he shows the Colossians what this new humanity might look like in a first-century Roman household, which was a highly authoritarian institution where the male patriarch held the power of life and death over his wife and children and slaves. Not so in a Christian household. Here, the risen Jesus is the true Lord. And so, in the Lord, the wife allows her husband to become responsible for her, and the husband is subject to Jesus by loving his wife and placing her well-being above his own. In a home where Jesus is Lord, children are not objects, but are called to maturity and to respect. And parents are to raise their children with patience and understanding. Christians who are slaves are to honor their human masters precisely because they're not the real master. Jesus is. And Christians who have slaves are to understand that this slave is not their property, but rather a fellow member of Jesus' body to be honored and embraced in love. Paul's walking a very fine line here. He is reshaping the most basic Roman institutions around Jesus, who rules by his self-giving love. And so while he doesn't abolish the household structure outright, the exalted Messiah demands that it be transformed, almost beyond the point of recognition for any Roman living in Colossae. You can see this most clearly in the letter's conclusion. After a request for prayer, Paul applies these instructions about Christian slaves and masters. And we discover that Tychicus is the one carrying and reading this letter to the Colossians. And he's accompanied by a certain Onesimus, who was a former slave to a Colossian Christian named Philemon. And we discover from another letter addressed to Philemon that Onesimus had escaped from his master. It was a crime worthy of imprisonment. But Paul asks the whole church to greet Onesimus as a faithful and beloved brother in the Lord. And then in the letter to Philemon, Paul says that he should receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a brother. Talk about ending the letter with a punch. So in the letter to the Colossians, Paul is inviting us to see that no part of human existence remains untouched by the loving and liberating rule of the risen Jesus. Our suffering, our temptation to compromise, our moral character, the power dynamics in our homes, all of it must be re-examined and transformed. We are invited to live in the present as if the new creation really arrived when Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what the letter to the Colossians is all about.
Yeah.
Now, before we go to the next one, I'll use myself in the process. Oh, yeah, wait, no, I did. There. Do you just turn it on for a second, Joyce? Before we go to the next one, that last part, did you catch the last part? Where the new creation exists now? Remember time not being a line, but being a disc, an auger? Sometimes the future presses into the present. So the idea is that in the present, we experience the future, which is the reign and rule of Christ. So Paul makes an allusion to this nature of Jewish time. So just a little side note, if you were going, wait a minute, how can we live in the future in the present? Because in Jewish time, it's all the same. So, all right, now it's interesting. One of the tools I've been using lately is Notebook LM, and it's a great little research tool. So what I did was I took just the text from Colossians, the New American Standard, and I inserted it in. And what it does is it compresses whatever you write, however long, into a 6-minute slideshow. So I've done this with my sermons on Friday. After I'm done, I'll stick it in there and watch the 6-minute slide. Okay, if I can get it, if it's getting it, I'm getting it, and I'm on the right track. So this is AI's interpretation of Colossians. This is 6 minutes. What is going on? Oh, wrong button.
All right, today we're cracking open a message that has echoed for 2,000 years, not from some grand hall or a fancy library, but from a prison cell. We're going to break down the short but absolutely packed ancient letter to the Colossians.
I mean, think about that for a second. What if one of the most powerful descriptions of reality and our purpose wasn't written by someone sitting in comfort, but by someone in chains? Well, that's the exact setup for the letter to the Colossians.
So to really get what's going on here, we have to understand the situation. You know, who's writing this? Who are they writing to? And what was the big deal that made this letter so urgent? Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The letter is from Paul, a major figure in early Christianity, along with his younger partner, Timothy. And they're writing to this community in a town called Colossae, a group of people Paul has never actually met face to face. He's only heard about them, but he feels this incredible need to write to them, all while he's locked up. And here's why. Paul's gotten word that some other teaching is making the rounds in Colossae. He calls it a philosophy and empty deception, something he says is just built on human ideas, not on the message they first heard. And this whole letter really is his response. So, how do you fight back against a competing philosophy? Well, Paul doesn't just send them a list of rules. No, he does something much more profound. He goes straight to the heart of everything and paints this incredible picture of who Jesus is. To make his case, he inserts what a lot of scholars think was basically an early Christian hit song, a hymn.
You have to remember, this was a culture that passed things down by memory. So this wasn't just some pretty poetry. It was a powerful, unforgettable piece of theology, designed to show that nothing and no one could ever be added to Christ. The hymn kicks off with this massive idea. It's actually pretty simple, but so deep. If you want to know what the invisible, unseen God is actually like, you just have to look at Jesus. He's the perfect picture, the exact representation.
And then comes this line, a phrase that, honestly, has caused a ton of debate. Firstborn of all creation. So, does that mean he was the first thing God created? Well, if you look at the context, the answer is a hard no. See, in their world, firstborn wasn't really about your birthday. It was a title. It meant you were the supreme heir, the one with the authority, the one who inherits the entire estate. So when Paul uses this word, he's saying that Christ holds the rank, the privilege, and the authority over everything that has ever been created. And just look at the scope of that claim. Paul leaves absolutely no wiggle room here. He's talking about everything, the physical stuff we can see, and the invisible spiritual world we can't. He says every government, every spiritual power, every single authority, it was all created through him and ultimately for him.
And that's the mic drop. That's the whole point of the hymn. It's all building towards this one massive conclusion, that Christ has absolute first place. The idea is that there isn't a single corner of reality, from a tiny atom to the biggest galaxy, where he isn't supreme. That is Paul's answer to the empty philosophy. Okay, so that is some huge cosmic level stuff. But for Paul, this isn't just some abstract idea you think about once in a while. No, it's a reality that is supposed to completely change how you live your actual day-to-day life. He uses this really powerful metaphor, this image of changing your clothes. He basically says that because of who Christ is, believers need to strip off their old way of living, like a dirty set of clothes, and put on something entirely new. And here's what that great exchange looks like. The old self, the stuff you take off, it's defined by things like anger, greed, and lying. But the new self you put on, that's a whole new wardrobe, defined by compassion, kindness, humility, and patience. And the two things that hold it all together are forgiveness and love. And the reason for all this is just as profound. In this new way of seeing things, all the old labels that people use to divide themselves, they just don't matter anymore. It doesn't matter if you're Greek or Jewish, slave or free. None of that is your main identity now. The only thing that truly matters is that everyone shares this new identity in Christ. So if you've gone through this huge internal change, if you've put on this new self, it has to show up somewhere, right? It has to make a difference in your family, at work, and just out in the world. So Paul applies this big principle to the most basic unit of the Roman world, the household. And what's wild is that he gives instructions to everyone in it, wives and husbands, kids and fathers, even slaves and masters. He's telling all of them to live out this new identity right where they are, in ways that would have been pretty radical and countercultural for their time. And this new life isn't just for how you treat people inside the group. When it comes to dealing with outsiders, Paul boils it down to three simple things. Stay committed to prayer, be wise in how you act, and always make sure your words are full of grace.
As the letter wraps up, it doesn't just end on a big theological point. It gets really personal, and it reminds you that at the end of the day, this is a real letter between real people who cared about each other. And just look at this list of names. It's like a snapshot of their community. You've got Tychicus, the mailman for this letter, Onesimus, who Paul calls a beloved brother, Luke, the doctor, and even Nympha, a woman who's hosting a church right in her own house. This isn't some dry document. It's a message carried through a network of real friendships.
And then you get this final personal touch. Paul actually takes the pen to write the last line himself, kind of like signing a letter to prove it's really from him. And his final request is just so heavy. Remember my imprisonment. It's a stark reminder of what this message was costing him.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The letter to the Colossians is more than just an old text. It's an urgent, passionate argument, written under the worst of circumstances, claiming that the supremacy of Christ isn't just a nice idea. It's the central truth of the entire universe. It leaves us with a question that still hits hard today. What kind of message is so important, so vital, that it has to be shared no matter what it costs?
There you go. So what do you think? How did Notebook do? Actually, yeah, it I think it handled it pretty well. All right. So, all right. Any thoughts as you listen to those two presentations? Anything leap off the screen, not off the page in this case? So, what's Colossians about? Putting on the new self, right? And what is the source of the new self? It's like I told Cheryl today in Bible study. If you answer my questions 50% of the time with Jesus, you will get it right. That all right. Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive, as we say in the book. We've already looked at the big idea, and that is that no part of the human existence of life remains untouched by the rule of Christ. His loving, liberating law of the risen Jesus affects every facet of our being. How does that lie in contrast to sometimes what we hear about religion? I can live like, on Saturday, but as long as I go to church on Sunday kind of thing. And, that's business. This is church. Don't confuse the two. He's so heavenly minded, he's no earthly good. All these ideas are so contrary to the message of Colossians, which is that every facet from family to business to how you relate to one another to how you view the heavens and what you think about molecules are all under the authority and the cosmic glory of who Jesus is. And so this is just a brief outline tonight as we will explore this in the weeks to come. And so chapter 1 through 23 is Jesus as the king over all creation. And that is going to trickle down and live itself out then in family. And then Paul talks about his suffering. He's introducing himself in chapter 1:24 through 2:5. And then in chapter 2, verses 6 through 3, we're going to talk about these two sources, the Judaizers, which you are now familiar with because of our study in Galatians, and then this new idea of mysticism and angel worship and all this kind of stuff. And then we're going to pick it up in chapters 3 and 4. We see once again who Jesus is and Paul's life. Then he brings up all his friends. And I really like the way the Bible Project talked about Onesimus and Philemon, so I showed the context there that this letter was written with a slave in the room who was a rebel and the very reality of that reconciliation. And then Paul's final written by his hand, remember me in prison. And I liked how Notebook said the whole thing, remember me in prison, that how often that is there. All right, that's the book, and that is open door. Words that get used, the most common word in the book of Colossians is the word God. Shows up 41 times, and then Paul uses a request, like a prayer. May the God of all grace. May this happen. May this happen. May this happen. It's the most active verb 31 times. So Paul throughout this book is going to be asking, may you do this. May you live your life this way. May. There's an emphasis on action, and then it kind of moves down as far as word usage into things like made and yourself, and nothing overly interesting, but those are the two. All right, tonight we are going to introduce a new word. But first we have to start with an old word with a new meaning. That make sense? All right. What does the word narrative mean?
Spin.
What's that?
Spin.
Spin?
Yeah, spin. Like steering it. Like
Oh, no, that's navigate. No, that's narrative. Bonnie, help me out.
Story that you give it.
Okay.
So it can be like you can spin it whatever way you want.
Oh, yes, yeah, how you spin it. Oh, sorry, Doug, I got lost there. Yes. Spin. I see where we're going. I'm thinking tires in the mud, but no. Yes, how you spin it. Or how you spin the story. Very good. Okay, anything else that comes to mind when you think of the word narrative?
It's an account of events.
Yeah, an account, right? Every story has three components: a beginning, This is profound. Hang in there. Bonnie, what might come after the beginning? Yeah, the content. The middle. So we have a beginning, content in the middle, and then we have the conclusion, right? My English teacher said there are two kinds of stories. There are conflicts and journeys. And the best story, tell both. Lord of the Rings is a story of conflict, but it's also a journey. So you think of Gone with the Wind, it is a journey from there to the end with a bunch of conflict in the middle. So that's really the two narrative structures of any story are the conflict, so the rom-com, right? They're far apart, she meets him, there's a conflict, they journey together to resolution, they fall in love, and so on. So really, it's the conflict that makes the story. If you took the conflict out of the rom-coms, what would you have? Boy meets girl, he's nice to her, they go on a date, they find out they have some things in common, and they keep dating for a couple of years. Finally, one of them pops the question, and they get married. It'd be a pretty boring story, right? If it was just a journey. So we have to spice it up. We've got to add some heat to the element, and that is we have to have conflict. So whether it's the movie Rocky or Star Wars or whatever your favorite movie is, you could fit within this framework. And more often than not, there's conflict. We talk about things like protagonists and antagonists, the main hero of the story and the person opposing the story, right? So this is the story. Every culture then has a narrative. Every culture tells us where the world began and how it all started. Then it has how we live within that story, and then it also speaks to how the world ends or how the story ends. So you think of indigenous cultures, you think of every culture has a story. Now, communities have the same kind of story. So when did Leader begin? 1913. That's our story. That gives us roots, right? Gives us an identity, gives us a certainty of who we are. Now, we don't know how the story is going to end. But we do know that there is a prediction at some time this story will end. You think about your life story, same thing. It follows this framework. I was born at the Leader Hospital on May 23rd, 1963. And I will, Lord willing, die in Leader Hospital, and whatever. And then there's the stuff in the middle. Why is it important for a culture, a narrative of a culture, to answer the beginning question?
Otherwise, nobody has any idea what's going on and nobody's doing it.
Exactly. Why are we here in the first place? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? Where did we come from? Right? You'll often see kids who are adopted. They want to find their birth parents. Right? Why? Because they want to know where the story began. Because that's part of my identity. Why do we want to know the end? Yeah, some certainty, right? Yeah. It'd be nice to know how the story ends. And we have an expectation how the story ends. Right? And so the story ends differently, shock or loss. It disrupts the middle of the story because the story was supposed to end, right off into the sunset. I have a piece of art. It shows two very old people sitting on a bench with a dog. That's Don and I's story. That's how our story is going to end. Two very old people sitting on a bench with a dog. And I have that on my dresser because that's on the end of our story. And it sits right next to our wedding picture. So it's like, that's the story. Beginning, all the stuff in the middle, and then the happy dog people at the end, right? It's significant. All right. Canada, every culture carried this. And the middle part is the critical part because it's the part about how you then live. How do you live within the story? All right. Then, weaving its way like the wind, and I want to make room on my blackboard, is our word that you might not. That's the pragmatic side, right? Every culture tells a story. What does our culture tell us how we began? No, secular culture. Big Bang. That's how it all began. Evolution, billions and zillions of years. Eyeballs, how it's going to end, the sun's going to burn out, the universe will go back into a Big Bang again, and the whole thing will recycle over again, right? That's kind of the story. And in the middle, who knows? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow, it's another Big Bang. All right. We'll get to these two stories in this. There once, this will all come into Colossians, don't worry, this is the foundational start. There once was a happy German fellow named Jung. Carl Jung. Carl Jung lived just around World War I and saw much of the tragedy and horror of World War I. And he coined a word, and it's there right in your notes, called the zeitgeist. You are going to sound like philosophers tomorrow at Coffee Row. The zeitgeist.
Thank you.
That word's not going to pop up in Coffee Row. You're going to say, you're going to have a goatee down. You'll hold your black coffee in your hand. You'll say it in your pipe, and what is the current zeitgeist? All right, good. And you'll know how to use it too. All right, the word zeitgeist is basically the spirit of the age. It means the feeling, the tone, the attitude. So you think of the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. It was a time of excess and wealth and forgotten, and it was a celebratory age. So think about the 1960s. What was the dominant spirit of America, let's say, in the 1960s? Rebellion, right? There was just something, Kennedy got shot, and then the other Kennedy got shot, then Martin Luther got shot, Martin Luther King Jr. got shot, then we had the Vietnam War, we had the Republican convention in Detroit, we had the Detroit Seven, we had all this stuff going on. There was just tour, and then rock and roll came along. It was the zeitgeist was turmoil, chaos, and then along came the hippies with love, right? So the zeitgeist changed from rebellion to the desire to be loving. What was the spirit of the 70s? Those of you who are old enough now to remember. We'll get to the 2000s later on. What was the spirit of the 70s? Peace and love. Yeah, it kind of continued, and then it moved into this glorious success, right? We got the rise of the drug culture, and the 70s were all about escapism. Disco came, and all, and material music changed. So we get this kind of wild, unchecked, celebratory sense of the 70s, but it was almost a response to madness. Right? Then along came the 80s, and what was the 80s like? Neon, good, bright colors. Disco, yeah. It was a fun decade. The 80s was a celebration of life and fun. Great music, great horrible cars. Great music, lots of fun. We got the rise of punk music, but we got that, and there was just a celebratory feeling in the 80s. Well, what was the 90s like? We just kept riding that train. You couldn't get any better. The 90s was the high water mark of Western civilization. It was the peak when if you couldn't pastor in the 90s, you may as well have quit. And then along came the 2000s. And what happened? Early 2000s, yeah. The 90s still gave us a little bit, but all of a sudden, what do we start to see by the end of the 2000s? We start to see downfall. By the time we get into 2010, yeah, we start to see now environmental concerns. We start to see a darkening of society, right? It starts to get more disparity. Then we get Y2K. What's that, Harlan? Yeah, it just got lots of mental health issues. Also, we start to see the rise. And now here we are today. Okay, that's zeitgeist. The zeitgeist is the spirit of the age. It's something that if you just close your eyes, you can feel it in the wind. So the current narrative is what we're going to talk about because we want to talk about what Paul presents. No, yes, I know I should stand up. Good. What Paul wants to present, as you saw, was within Roman culture, there was a current narrative of how the world worked. And Christianity then presents an alternate narrative. And this is where our book comes into place and where our study will find its home with us. And that is, there's the culture's zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and there's the cultural narrative, the story of the age. How the culture answers the story or writes the story. Then there is the Christian zeitgeist, the spirit of the Christian, which is the spirit of patience and hope. We'll see the contrast, but also the Christian narrative. And what's happening in Colossians is two narratives are at odds with each other, and then a third one injects itself. There is we'll call it two. For simply say, there is the narrative of the culture, that is This Gnosticism we're going to tell us, sweetie. This Gnosticism I can talk to her. She's fine. This Gnosticism we talked about, the Hebrew culture, and then the strong sense of Roman culture, right? That's the one narrative. Remember, how do the Romans view time? Flat, non-progressive, right? That's part of their narrative. Don't change anything. Preserve, protect the empire. So that's part of how you view time. And along comes Christianity, and it offers what we call the alternative narrative. A new story, a new way of looking at beginnings, middle, and ending, a new spirit. And Paul talked about that in Corinthians last week. We saw in 2 Corinthians 10, a different spirit. And so while these words may sound like philosophical ideas, like, woo, they're not. They're grounded in how we live. That is, what story do we tell ourselves about life? What is of value? What is to be pursued? What is good? Has status? What has power? And then there's the overarching spirit. If you were to describe the spirit of our current day, what color would you give it? Black, without a doubt. Look at how people dress. Go to a car dealership. We were at the oh, sorry, sweetie. When we were in Medicine Hat at this church with Lionel, I said, I will give you $1 for every car that's not black, white, or silver. In the end, I owed him $20. Because this huge parking lot, hundreds of vehicles, there was about 20 that weren't black. Okay? If you were to describe the current spirit of our age as a food, how would you describe it? What food would you pick? It sure isn't birthday cake.
Saltine crackers.
Oh, ouch. Okay, a dry saltine. What else? How else? What food would you pick to describe the spirit of our times? Who said squash? Why squash, Doug? Squash. Good, I like it. Anybody else? What food would you pick?
Sardine.
Oh. Donna, what would you pick? Sardine sandwiches? An unpleasant combination? Good. All right. If you were to pick a food, okay, let's start. Color that describes the spirit of Christ and the Christian church, what color would you pick? White? Yeah, something bright, cheery, good. Light blue, maybe? Good. What food would you pick? A food. What's that?
Fruit.
Good, yeah. Okay. Good. All right. I'll ask you one more. We had food, we had fruit, music. Okay, what music personifies or describes it or best expresses the spirit of our age?
Like, to Christ?
No, it just outside on this side of the equation.
Rap or hip hop music about drugs or other music players.
Escapism, right? It's strong into escapism. Yeah. Yeah, this. And what dominant emotion is on this side of the equation? Depression. Despair. Yeah. It's depression and its cousins, and then a whole lot of anger.
Yeah.
It's interesting. If you were, privileged to live in the 80s, you wouldn't have said this until punk came along. And then punk in the late 80s and the early 90s brought with it a certain degree of depression and anger. And so this is what zeitgeist is. Don't worry about the word, but are you getting the idea? That it's the spirit of an age, and that spirit can be felt in music, in clothes, in colors, in even how, if you look at McDonald's used to be what? A happy place. There were play slides and colors and things, and now McDonald's looks like a depressed 40-year-old. You walk in and it's drab, and there's a computer screen that sort of works sometimes, and there's flies in the lighting. It's a depressing place where it used to be like, I want to go there for my birthday. Not anymore. And you look at most restaurants now, they're dark and they're kind of depressing. They're not fun anymore. What happened to TGI Fridays or Chuck E. Cheese's, places that were fun to go to? Not anymore. So that's zeitgeist. Or let's just take a little bit before we jump into the Christian side of it. Let's take a look. So I looked up today what's happening in Canada. What is the current narrative? So this was the assessment of Canada. Multiculturalism as identity. Canada is described as the world's first post-national state, meaning that no singular core identity exists. 22% of the population have a foreign tongue. Secondly, a shift from biculturalism, it used to be the French versus English, to now diversity, right? We have all kinds of languages. Tagalog is the second most spoken language in Saskatchewan. An emphasis, at least from the government, on progressive issues and progressive values. And so we get a very progressive culture. Number four, the whole issue of reconciliation between peoples is being pushed. And fifth, the post-national idea, what it means to no longer be Canadian. And then regionalism. All right, you got that list in front of you? Is there anything on that list that I missed that would describe the current narrative of Canada? Canada is a divided people. We are fragmented. We are multicultural. There is no unifying force anymore. Because, Donna, growing up, how many TV channels were there? Sometimes one. So on a Sunday night or a Saturday night, everybody in Canada watched the same TV show. And Monday morning at school, we all talked about the same TV show, right? Did you watch Walt Disney last night? And you said, no, I went to church instead. But there at least was a collective narrative. By the way, if you were forced to watch Johnny, what was his name? Tommy Hunter, you may be allowed compensation for your childhood. That's no, this common bond, right? What do we have now? Fragmented. How many TV channels are there? Plus YouTube. Like Doug and I were saying, I don't watch TV. I watch the YouTube. All right. And so we get this narrative, which is fragmented. So I asked the all-wise, knowing internet, I said, what is the current spirit of the age? And here's what it came up with. The current early 2026 is a paradox of high-tech acceleration, which is AI, digital, and a romantic backlash against it. So there's this sense of, I showed you, an AI developed product, right? High-tech solution. It's humiliating how good it was because it grasped it. But in response, there's also been a massive backlash again to artisan. People want the homemade candle. They want the music written by the girl next door. There's a growing push against that culture. So we have on one side, we have industry and all of that pushing technology. We also have a backlash of now we have more stay-at-home moms, right? There's, what is it called? Conservative moms, or there's a title for it actually now. Doesn't matter. But you get this sense. And so that's happening in it. So we have this AI data-driven existence with an anti-tech backlash, this cultural rebellion against the dominance of the they call it the algorithmic life, right? We long for authenticity. We long for what they call analog experiences, that is touch and taste. If you were born prior to 1965, you're considered the last of the analog generation. That is the generation before technology took over. Okay? So if your bike broke when you were 9, who could fix it? Your dad or you. You're riding down the road and the chain falls off. What do? You put it back on, right? You are the analog generation. I can fix this, right? Now, when I'm on my e-scooter and it quits, what do? I got to throw it out, get a new one. I can't fix it. I use the app and I call my mom and she comes and picks me up, right? That's the contrasting difference. An analog generation is the one who can fix it. When you were out and you were on your bicycle or on your horse and you were 3 miles down a gravel road and you fell off and you got hurt, who fixed it? You did. You had no choice, right? Or else your brother did, came along and laughed at you and did whatever, right? First time I ever rode my bike, we're in Swift Current. I'm going down the hill. We're about, half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from home. Target fixation. I look at a parked car. What do? I drove right into the parked car. Boom, hit the parked car, went flying over to the parked car, bent my bicycle up. My brother, who was with me on his bicycle, laughed. And basically we walked home, dragging the stupid broken bicycle, right? That's an analog child. Analog child says, I hurt myself, I can fix myself. I have broke the bike, I can fix my bike. The digital child doesn't have that option, right? Why? Because they pick up their phone and they'll call for help. They don't know how, they don't need to help themselves. All right. That's part of this response. The generation says we're tired of the digital. We want that analog experience again. We want to know what ice cream tastes like. Okay, sustainability and inclusivity. Of course, we couldn't be Canadian without talking about environmental issues and social diversity and all that kind of stuff. The other key issue is called polarized individualism. All right, that means individuals are primary now. It's all about the individual. It's all about you finding out who you are. All right, Christina told me about a new cultural phenomenon within a certain age group called clowncore. This is a real thing. I looked it up. I thought she was joking with me. So some people, they'll embrace looking like a cowboy. That's called cowboy core. In other words, you kind of dress like a cowboy. You could have farmer core. You could have business core. Well, clown core is when people dress like clowns in public. Short skirts, makeup, black and white striped pantyhose, big eyes, funny hair, all that kind of, and it's a real thing. So I thought she was goofing me around. That's right. That would be like pet core or cat core, whatever, right? In other words, gross individualism at the expense of any other collective society. So we don't have a unified society anymore, right? You just go be you. You find out who you are. You live your truth. And if you want to dress like a cat, what's that? You be you. Exactly. Go, girl. You be you. You know? And this whole mindset of you just go discover who you are. And that's life's purpose, is for you to discover. And if you discover you're a clown, go be a clown. If you discover you're a cat, if you want to be a cowboy, go be a cowboy. It doesn't really matter. Okay, this is called polarized individualism. Polarized means that shift of light, right? That the central project of life is to find out who you are. And then resilience amongst uncertainty. What the other word that we should have put on here, which I think is correct, is fatigue. People are tired. They're tired of it all. They're tired of the conflict. They're tired of this. They're tired of that. Even 20-year-olds are tired. Right? Used to be we waited until we were in our mid-40s to have a midlife crisis. I've dealt with 20-year-olds having midlife crisis, wondering who they are and what's my purpose and why shouldn't I just sell it all, buy a van and go to Hawaii kind of thing, right? Hawaii. Yeah. What's that? You know, in a van, even in a really good van. All right, so I'll wrap this up, and then I want to draw this to a conclusion. The other page you have, there's a writer, she's in her 20s, and she goes by the name of Community Coin, and the same thing. She wrote an article, this isn't AI, this is her observation. She just made a few observations that she called the disorientation that leads to chaos, because people are so disoriented. Who am I? What's the meaning of life? That they're actually living in a constant, heightened, chaotic state. We've looked at the last few weeks or months, rebellion in the streets, protests, this stuff, fragmentation. Division is kind of the idea of two. Now we're fragmented. There's just all these little pockets of reality. If you want to find a like-minded group, you'll find it, right? No shared frame of reference. Again, not everybody watches Walt Disney anymore. You used to be able to do, it was great at men's breakfast. Shane and Brett and I were talking about Fallout, right? There was this moment, and you could see the sports guys going, hey, it was a good moment because there was a sense of fragmented. We have our own little culture, right? No, but we have a shared frame of reference. Facts are optional. Reality is customizable. The relentless pressure to optimize yourself to be the best you can be, whether it's emotionally or financially or physically. They're saying now that for men in their 50s and 60s, what the big flex is? It's not the car you drive. It's not the watch you wear. The big flex for men in 50s and 60s is fitness, to be ripped. That's the big, I'm 50, I'm 60, look at me, I'm still, Arnold Schwarzenegger, not me, but that's the big flex now, right? So this idea of maximizing yourself, as Elena mentioned before, a culture obsessed with mental health, yet incapable of being mentally healthy. People feel used up. This lady, she had very good insight. This is just a summary. Individualism has reached a strange, grotesque extreme. Individuality has become the central project of life, not just who you are, but how you present it, because you've got to protect your brand. And every Instagram person has a brand, and you got to get on and you got to do the Meyer brand and have people have followers and your feed so that then you have the brand. You can start making hats. Literally, that's what people do. They create their brand and want people to follow it. And then community has thinned out, networks and audiences of followers, but people don't know. And beneath all, I thought that was interesting. She said, simmering what? Resentment. Anger. There is, you talk to people, there is an undertone of anger in almost everybody I talk to, whether it's the government or confusion, right? What's going on with the weather? They're tired, they're sad, they're angry, and they're uncertain. Or you might say that the spirit of the 70s was optimism. Even the late 60s was fairly optimistic, especially the 80s and the 90s were very optimistic. The world was going to get better. If you look at the decade we're in now, the 20s, it will be marked by these hallmarks, right? It will be a time of uncertainty, resentment, fatigue, anger, depression, and horrible fragmentation.
I don't think there's been a time where we have more terrible leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's impressive in itself.
Yeah, and that leads to uncertainty. And then you start getting in inflation, and you start getting into value loss. Then that all feeds into this, right? And then you get a season of economic depression. They all feed into this. So we are living in a very fascinating time. We are living in some of the darkest seasons in the last 50 years.
And it's spread by social media.
Absolutely not. And it's viral, right? Where if somebody's having a bad day, they'll post it on Facebook, and you can literally go on and you can watch 50 people cry today. Well, what does that do to your psyche, right? Or we see items in the news, and it's this constant stream. Every source now talks about a horrible event. And where we used to be oblivious to events, let's say happening in Yemen, now it's right in front of us. It's live feed of that child suffering. Well, what does that do to your psyche after a while? Right? It destroys your resiliency.
Like, you would have to do
Exactly.
They're also spinning a narrative.
Absolutely. They're controlling the narrative. Yeah. And one time, if something horrible happened, you heard about it at noon. And if you're at school, you didn't. Or at work, maybe, and you came home, you turned on the 6 o'clock news, and then, oh no. Now it's constant, right? Our phone pings, your watch picks it up, that we're being fed this. And this is the zeitgeist of our time. Constant information. And it's very, very rarely ever positive. Or else people complain about it, right? The Super Bowl halftime, and all we hear is 15 million complaints, right? Or did you notice that what's her name's? Her husband's. She took the wedding picture off the back, and she like, but and we're nitpicking every little detail of. Okay, we got to stop there. That's this. So here's the challenge for us now. What is the Christian narrative in response to it? If that's the narrative and the spirit of our time, how are we to live in such a way that it's opposite? What is the Christian narrative? Hope.
joy,
Of all things, joy. Our music should reflect that, right? Good. What else is the Christian spirit or narrative? I won't write them all down. Refreshment, renewal. In a world of chaos, what's our message?
trust in God.
Trust in God. God is on the throne. He's orchestrating all things to the fulfillment of his time. This is not chaos. This is orchestration of God's timing. Good. What else is the Christian narrative?
It's Christ-centered.
Christ-centered, not self-centered, right? How high contrast can you be? Yeah. It's community-based versus isolationist, right? As much as media is important to us and we stream our services, that's a supplement to our community, right? If you're at home and you're sick, or you can't be with us tonight, it's not our primary. Our primary goal is always contact. So what I want you to see is that this counter narrative, and I'll put to this, my thesis in this book is that Christianity offers a better narrative. The world offers us a terrible narrative and a depressing zeitgeist. We look at the story, not to pinpoint the events of this young shooter up in BC, the narrative he had about his own life, versus in high contrast to the Christian narrative. Christianity offers the true narrative and a much better narrative. All right, I'll wrap it up with this. It should be on your last page. In the time of Paul, the Christian church had a different story to tell the culture. And we'll see that especially in the area of family. Husbands, love your wives, and that. A fellow named Justin saw the Roman life as a habit of unfreedom, characterized, see if this sounds familiar, unfreedom, characterized by addictive practices in 4 key areas: sexual ethics, marred by fornication, the occult, trapped in the magic arts, wealth and possessions, competitive acquisitiveness, in other words, owning stuff, violence, fear of strangers, filled with hatred and murder towards people of different tribes and customs. Just reports that Christians also struggle. That was the Roman narrative. Fear, power, sexual immorality, materialism. What does Christianity come along and do? Offers a different narrative. The early Christians sensed that the way they lived their lives, was the most authentic way of communicating their faith. And here's the quote from this source. Rather than relying solely on doctrinal arguments, not that they didn't, they emphasized their actions, their habits, and how they lived as a community enacted their belief. Alan Krieger says, when challenged about their ideas, Christians pointed to their behavior. They believed their habits, their embodied behavior, was eloquent enough. This lived witness, marked by patience, sexual purity, care for the poor, devotion to worship, was seen as a compelling counterculture testimony to the gospel, or of the gospel. That this counter narrative was their witness. And it was this counter narrative that drew people to Christ. They found a different story. And I think as Christians, we ask ourselves, how can we be a witness to the world? We become a witness to the world by living a counter narrative, by having not a counterfeit, but a true reality. This is counterfeit. And as we live this counter narrative, it will pull people towards, they will see something. Because right now, what the world, the narrative of the current age is offering is depression. If I say to you, come here, I've got this world, come, I'll see depression, resentment, uncertainty, and fragmentation. Any takers? How about this? Community, caring, grace, peace, patience, a story that begins in glory and ends in glory. You go, man, that sounds like a better story. Christianity has a better story. Now, the challenge for us is to tell it. All right, that's Colossians. And our word of the day today is zeitgeist.